So, SpriteTools. It's been a long time since I've posted an official update or a video on this topic, and so I wanted to finally break the silence and give some information as to what I am currently working on and what my plans are. First of all, my original plan was to create a easy interface for homebrew developers on the 3DS to draw graphics to the screen, get stuff loaded, get stuff working. There was one problem with that, and it's that I had no clue how to program, and so I programmed it all completely wrong and terribly, and so that was my first failure. Then I got into college and I started learning how to actually program, and it was around this time that I thought, okay, I should reboot this. I should try it a second time. Then I found out that while I was starting to learn the basics of programming, I still had no clue how the game engine worked or how to do anything like that, so I gave up on it a second time. At that point, I figured I will either be relearning or learning new things over and over and keep restarting this project, or I can put it on hold for a little bit until I figure out what I'm actually doing. So I decided to put it on hold until I figured out and was taught how to actually program a working game engine by myself that was competent and wasn't a complete waste of code. It was not complete garbage. After that happened, SF2D was deprecated, meaning SpriteTools was effectively deprecated as well, if it wasn't already. And so that also brought the problem of, well, now I'm going to have to rewrite all of the graphics implementation, so that was just another reason to put it on hold. And at that point, I officially deprecated it. So now I'm after that, I sent out this tweet on the SpriteTools Twitter account, and that you may notice it has a new name and icon, and that is because this is the new icon of something I'm calling BrewTools, which is, first of all, so BrewTools is different to SpriteTools in that, first of all, I changed the name because I'm wanting BrewTools to more openly show this is not just for rendering, this is not just for graphics, this is also for debugging tools and audio and physics and game states and all these other things that make a game engine complete. Because I want this to be a free open source game engine, as opposed to here's how you can get graphics on the screen, now figure it out for yourself. It's also being written in C++ instead of C. That's for organizational as well as just functionality reasons. The other giant change is that it is multi-platform. It currently is compiling on Windows and 3DS. I'm planning to port it to the Wii U because I understand that homebrew on the Wii U is a crazy ordeal, and that really should be easier by now. And there are, as far as I can tell, no libraries for this system. And the platforms I could possibly do in the future, I'm probably also going to do Linux, just because porting from Windows to Linux, if I already have all this stuff set up for 3DS and Wii U, that shouldn't be as big of an undertaking. I possibly can port it to Mac because Mac OS, because it should be very similar to Linux. That being said, I don't have a Mac computer to test on, and my current desktop, for some reason, its CPU does not support virtualization, so I can't run a VM. I'm looking into options for that kind of stuff anyway. And then, of course, people want to know, is it going to be on the Switch? And to that I say a giant maybe, because currently we have homebrew execution on the Switch, but no homebrew is written for the Switch, and also it's only on one firmware version, and that will obviously, this will all change in the future. The Switch is combining the 3DS and Wii U homebrew communities, and so we're going to get a lot more power behind this homebrew and hacking effort. That being said, I don't want to promise anything now because we have no clue what programming on this thing's going to look like. I would love to port this to the Switch, but I don't. We don't know yet. That being said, the implementation of using BrewTools and programming something is entirely one-to-one across all platforms. The thing about so Windows is using OpenGL, and that's also going to help with porting to Linux. And for anyone who's programmed with OpenGL and on the 3DS, or even just on the 3DS and or looked at Wii U implementation or any, like, if you program multi-platform, you know that there are a bunch of code changes you have to make, and between like just the idea of the 3DS has 2 screens on it. How do I port that to Windows? Well, you could make 2 physical windows, but now you have to manage both of them, and that's confusing. And you know, just how do you make this all work? And Windows on an operating system like Windows or Linux are entirely different than the screens on a 3DS, because the windows can be any position on the screen and they have the potential to be resized, and they are a much higher resolution. It's completely different. The idea that I'm going into with BrewTools is you program it one way and you type make 3DS and it will compile for 3DS, and you type make Windows, it will compile for Windows, or just make all and it will compile for all platforms. And you test it, and it will look as close as possible to identical on all platforms. And obviously, this is an undertaking specifically with how I'm going to set up the different screens and windows across 3DS and Windows. But there are, when in this implementation, there are no like long checks of what am I compiling for, because BrewTools will take care of that for you. As to the current progress, I do have some of it in a private GitHub repo that I want to show like a quick example of. Like there we go. So like this is, I just cleared the repository. If I ls, this is the stuff in here. So if I just do make, it will make the different platforms, libraries, and I'm having this set up where it's building. I should do make J8. That's much faster. Okay. Oh, right, yes, because I'm working on what is it? I'm working on the graphics. I'm working on making triangles and meshes and things like that. That being said, I do have a compiled library if I cd testing cd libs. So I do have this pre-compiled library. When you make all, then you will end up with libBrewTools Win, libBrewTools 3DS, and libBrewTools Wii U. 3DS and Wii U automatically are copied into the correct like DevKit Pro folders. But obviously Windows is developed entirely differently, and I don't want to be messing with people's paths, so I'm just saying if you try to do make Windows install, it'll tell you like, well, it's gonna try to make it, but it gives you a message, this can't be installed, copy it in, here's how you copy it in. If I actually do make tutorial, it'll explain to you how to use it and everything. So if I cat my main or source main.c, source cat. Oh, right, CPP. Then, so this is my main.cpp file. This isn't required, this kind of thing. I'm just doing this as an example to show that if you needed it or wanted it, this is how you would do it. And this is just to show like it is the same code running on a different thing. This is a macro. I kind of borrowed it from Visual Studio just to avoid errors if you're like, I know that because cross-platform things are given to functions that might not be used. But yeah, this is basically like you make the engine. The engine is a singleton, meaning you call get, and if it exists, it gives it to you. If it doesn't, it makes it, then it gives it to you. You can engine initialize all. You don't have to. This will just create all the other systems. But let's say I'm not using trace. I'm just using graphics, or I'm not using time because I don't need to sleep or anything. Then I can avoid calling this and trace, let's say. And whenever I get system, the name of the system, it will create it for me. And the same thing works for the systems in the engine. They're all created once. Trace is like outputting to the console on screen or the selected console, because on 3DS and Wii U, you've got two screens. So you can make a console. I make B console for bottom console, which is a new console, name's bottom screen, and it's on Windows screen bottom, which is a new console window. And then I've got down here, this is like T console for the top console on the top screen, and they're printed different messages. And I want to show like kind of how this works across Windows and 3DS, and maybe get feedback from the community on if somebody has a better idea, or if somebody thinks like, well, actually, I would like this kind of option for how it's displayed. And trace can also output to a file, so I'm having an output to bttrace.log. Yeah, you can, so I'm creating these consoles and then selecting them, which just sets the trace to say this is currently the console I have selected, and then the console can have all the information about how it's to be printed to. I want to change this slightly in the future, probably with like a manual graphics implementation of text drawing to a OpenGL window or a graphics window, rather than just outputting to a console, specifically because if you output to a console on a 3DS and then try to draw graphics, or draw graphics and then try to switch to a console, they use different graphics. Like, it's kind of, I don't really know how to describe it. I haven't worked too closely with it, but basically it messes up how things look. They're reading from the they're reading from the heap differently, I'll say. That, yeah, that explains it well enough, I think. And so if I were to draw an image and then switch to the console, that image is now being completely messed up and drawn underneath the console and on top of the console, and it looks terrible. And so if I were to manually implement this with a default font, then you could use your own font, you could reposition it, you could have it on top of it and underneath other things. And so that's my plan for a few weeks from now. Add window lets me create a new graphics window. Like I said, on Windows, this is using OpenGL. On 3DS, I have to make my own implementation, which I am basing heavily off of SF2D, both because I understand it very excuse me, I understand it very well, and I want people who understand it to be able to move to this, because now it's deprecated. So you're either using code that might not work, or you're on your own. So I want this to resemble that, so that people who are left on their own can now move to this without too much trouble. Then this is just to sleep. I made this sleep function in the time system just so that because Windows has a few ways of doing this. There's now Chrono in C++11, I think. I think that's when it got implemented. But 3DS doesn't have any function, so this is just a way for both systems to use it from one function. Safe delete is a macro that deletes the thing this is pointing to and then sets it to null so that you can check afterwards to prevent use after free errors and crashes. And T console is being selected, then it's being deleted, and then I'm trying to output to it. If it's been deleted, then it tells Trace like, hey, stop printing to me. And you'll see that this message doesn't get printed to a console, but it does get printed to bttrace.log. And then the engine gets shut down, which tells all the systems like update one last time and then stop everything you're doing because the thing is closing, and then it returns 0. So I am going to make 3DS, not Wii U, Windows, and this is going to go ahead and, oh, it's already been made. I'll make clean 3DS Windows just to show that it all works correctly. Oops, I haven't written this yet, sorry, that's just for Wii U, because none of this has been ported to the Wii U yet. I want to get graphics working on 3DS and Windows so that I can test things and put something out so that people can start developing and then just be, I will promise that it will work. So now I have testing 3ds.3dsx for the 3DS and testing win.exe for Windows. So if I do testing win, then you see hello world, I'm on bottom, I'm on top, I'm running Windows. It creates that window that I asked it for earlier, and now it's sleeping for 1 second and counting up by 1. If I go ahead and open Citra, then it's got my testing 3ds.3dsx, and if I open it, it's going to say, I'm on top, hello world, I'm on bottom, running on a 3DS, this one said running on Windows, and now it's also sleeping for 1 second and counting up. So I made no code changes to that, and it's running on 2 completely different systems with nothing, no, like, so imagine doing that with like any kind of homebrew that you're developing. That is my goal, is I want it to be that easy. Of course, when this gets to 60, it's going to crash because it's on Citra, and Citra doesn't understand how to deal with main returning anything. So I'm going to close that before that happens. Oh, and this also is printed if back here when I deleted it, this one, it tells the trace, hey, stop looking at me, and also prints out this if it is currently selected, just to like as a warning of like, hey, why isn't anything being printed? Well, you deleted it already. It's just a safety thing. It doesn't actually like it's fine. It's intended. So one thing that I do think is important that I want to point out is that I have created a slight license change between SpriteTools and BrewTools. SpriteTools was under the MIT license, meaning anybody could edit it, download it, use it, sell it, anything that they wanted to do, and they was completely within their rights to, and anyone could do it, and I wouldn't come after you. The one change that I made is that I'm still using mostly the same MIT license, but I have removed the ability for create things you create with BrewTools to be sold. That is because I don't know where I'm going with this yet, and also there are some legal things. As far as I know, nobody really sells homebrew software, so I don't know the legality of that, especially with how Nintendo feels about their IPs. Like, I don't know how they feel about homebrew being sold for their systems, even though it doesn't really have to do with their systems. And if they were upset about that, do they come after me because I'm allowing that to happen? And so I'm figuring if I don't allow that in the first place, there can't be any problems. The other thing is, I don't know how far I'm going to take this. If I take this to a full-on game engine and I add some kind of editor front end where you can just drag and drop stuff, that I might want to charge for this in the future. I will always have a free version if that is the case, and it will probably just be, if you sell this, X percentage goes to the developing team of BrewTools. And I say developing team or developers because I may also set up an LLC for myself just as another like legal safety net, because that it's relatively easy to do, and it just would protect me and any other developers I decide to bring on from any kind of persecution, i.e. from Nintendo or whatever happens that I was talking about earlier. Anything else that I have planned would be I'm wanting to do a C++ programming tutorial that covers the basics to start programming with no real high level stuff. And by high level, I mean like I'm not going to explain step by step how to make a game engine, but I do want to explain lower level concepts like how does the stack work? Because there are plenty of excellent C and C++ tutorials on YouTube, but I watched probably 3 or 4 like all the way through, and none really talk about the stack compared to the heap, or like why you might allocate something to memory and why you might do it a certain way, and why I++ is different than ++I, and why you might use them differently. So I do want to make a tutorial that covers the basics and talks about why you do things the way you do it, rather than just do this because this is convention. And while I do want to talk about the lower level concepts, I also want it to be easy to understand for newcomers and the less computer literate. So like people who have maybe never programmed before and were told that they might find it interesting, or people who have thought about it but thought, nah, it's too complicated, I don't want to try, just because I think programming is cool and I want to get other people into programming. And that's also the reason I started working on SpriteTools in the first place, is because programming and 3DS homebrew and hacking is cool and there aren't enough people into it. So please read the description of the video there, where I will be answering some frequently asked questions, putting some links, and if I didn't answer anything you were curious about for BrewTools or otherwise, please post a comment in the down below, not in the description. And yeah, I hope to have some progress by a week or 2 from now. Thank you for watching my update video on BrewTools, and I hope to see you in the future.